this Department of War. So we won the First World War, we won the Second World War, we won everything before that and in between, and then we decided to go woke and we changed the name to Department of Defense. So we're going Department of War.
President Trump ordering a sweeping change at the Pentagon, renaming the overseeing agency the Department of War. Officially, it's called the Department of Defense, but President Trump's executive order allows the Pentagon to use the secondary title, Department of War, and for the secretary to be called the Secretary of War. Here to explain more of the move and what it all means is friend of the show, Emory political science professor Andra Gillespie. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so at one point it was called the Department of War, then it got changed to the Department of Defense, and now he's trying to change it back to the Department of War. Why the switch? Why do we keep switching this up?
Well, this is a marketing change, and it's largely a symbolic gesture because the president cannot officially change the Defense Department to the War Department without congressional approval. So just for some context, it was the National Security Act of 1947 that, among other things, created a Department of Defense. And it's really interesting, if you go back and you read the statute, what the National Security Act of 1947 was doing was it was taking some agencies that did exist and it morphs them into the entities that we know today. So it helps to create, goes from the OSS to what we now know as the CIA. It creates the National Security Council. It changes the War Department to the Department of the Army so that it can create a Department of the Navy and so that it can create the Air Force, because the Air Force was the Army Air Corps during World War II. And then the Department of Defense is giving it civilian control, and it's supposed to provide some type of coordination between the agencies. So thus it's putting the Secretary of Defense over all of these other departments because he's the one that's going to have to coordinate with them. So, I mean, it's not as simple as President Trump suggested. And that's in that comment, he can't do it unilaterally. And there is still sort of the idea that he is making a very symbolic move more than he is making a substantive move.
So what is the meaning behind that? What he's done is given them the ability to call it within themselves. So kind of like an in-house type of a name?
It is an in-house name. So, I mean, yesterday I tried, like when I put in defense.gov yesterday, that it switched over to like war.gov. So similar to like you still use twitter.com, right? It'll automatically switch you over to x.com. What you will probably see happening is in a lot of official documentation, and things are still going to be referred to as the Department of Defense, but at least amongst Trump loyalists and within his administration, he's going to refer to DOD as the Department of War. And so we're going to use them interchangeably. And colloquially, but we won't necessarily do that in terms of official correspondence and things, even though that executive order does allow for, insignia and letterhead and things to change.
Yeah. How does this fit in terms of renaming other agencies?
Well, I mean, some of those are about restructuring entirely. This isn't about restructuring. This is about branding and marketing. And so while I certainly want to give President Trump his propers for branding and marketing in his private life, right here, I think we have to ask, well, what is the political import? So one, it creates a semblance of activity where perhaps a whole lot doesn't exist. But this is actually being done at a great cost because it costs a lot to kind of come up with new brands and redo letterhead and all of those kinds of things. And then also it's really important for us to think about what does it mean to rename the Department of Defense the Department of War. And then one of your first real public discussions about it is about talking about, perhaps somewhat inaccurately, sending the Defense Department to an American city to help deter crime. So, I mean, it's to make American defense look muscular. He argues that a defense kind of puts you on a bit of a posture. It doesn't allow you to sort of talk about the offensive. But that does raise other questions about legality. It raises questions about sort of, the post-World War II world order, where we talk about actually not going out and being aggressive and waiting until you're attacked to try to use lethal and military force. But a lot of this is about posturing more so than it is about anything substantive.
So when we look back about a couple of years from now, will the renaming be remembered as a symbolic political flourish or something totally different?
Well, I mean, I think it depends on where we are in terms of American government. If our institutions hold, I suspect that we will revert back to kind of consistently calling the Department of Defense the Department of Defense. If a Democrat succeeds President Trump as president, they will undoubtedly officially change all the internal nomenclature back to the Department of Defense. If America takes a more authoritarian turn and we are less democratic than we have historically been, or if you see another MAGA Republican come in and try to take over, as president of the United States, then we might actually see a certain type of consistency. I think the big thing that we need to think about is, just as it took a congressional act to create the Department of Defense and to rename the Department of War in 1947, I think the next move will be, do we see Congress actually take this up to actually provide the statutory support for this? And in particular, whether or not this renaming in the US Senate could actually qualify per the parliamentarian as being something that could fall under reconciliation, because that's going to change the vote threshold by which you need to be able to get it on the floor. So if it falls under reconciliation, you don't actually need, you can make it filibuster proof so that you only need 51 votes in order to get the discussion to advance. But if it's just symbolic and they don't see any monetary aspect to the naming of the bill, then you probably need 60 votes in order to get it onto the floor, at which point I don't think even in this Senate with Republican control that you could make that happen, and this really is rendered a symbolic act.
Got it. Professor Gillespie, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for your insight.